In the far reaches of space, where power means everything and mercy means nothing, a young woman with green skin and snow-white hair stood frozen in a moment that would change her life forever. Her name was Lorana, and she was about to discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the quietest voices. The weight of 100 unspoken words crushed down on Lorana's chest like stones as she stood perfectly still in the enormous hall. Her green skin seemed to glow under the cold light from the floating chandeliers that hung high above her head. The air around her felt thick and heavy, filled with the smell of polished metal and expensive perfumes. But underneath all those fancy scents was something bitter, the smell of hatred and disgust that followed the noble people around like an invisible cloud. She knew she didn't belong in this place. She had never belonged here, not really. And now, after all these years of feeling like an outsider in her own home, she was being handed over to a stranger like she was nothing more than a pretty object to be traded away. Her father, Baron Zelther, stood at the front of the great chamber like a king on his throne. His presence filled the entire room, making everyone else seem small and unimportant. He was a man built from pride and power, someone who had never learned the meaning of kindness. His dark red robes flowed behind him as he moved, looking like spilled blood across the white marble floor. When he turned to look at the human man standing before him, his black eyes showed no warmth at all, only cold calculation. The man her father was speaking to was someone Lorana had never seen before in her life. Yet somehow, deep in her heart, she could sense that this stranger would change everything about her world. The feeling scared her and excited her at the same time. The room had fallen completely silent except for the soft humming sound of the floating banners that carried her father's symbol. That symbol was more than just decoration, it was a sign of power, a way of showing everyone in this part of the galaxy who was in charge. Tonight, that same symbol was being used to close a deal that involved her. The Baron's voice suddenly cut through the silence like a sharp knife through silk. "Commander Garen Wolf," he said, and his tone was full of mockery even though his face showed no emotion at all. "You have served me well over the years. You've won battles that other people said were impossible to win. You've defeated enemies that everyone thought were too strong to beat. You have proven that you are worthy of my trust." He took one careful step forward, his boots clicking against the marble floor. "And I am a man who always keeps his promises." Lorana felt her fingers curl up into tight fists at her sides. She knew what was coming next. She had known this day would arrive eventually, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "As I promised you," the Baron continued, gesturing toward her without even bothering to look in her direction, "I present to you a prize that matches the greatness of your victories. My daughter, Lorana." In that instant, every single person in the room turned to stare at her. She felt their eyes on her like physical weight, and a wave of heat crawled up her spine like fire. But she kept her face completely neutral, her expression as cold and unmovable as the stone pillars that surrounded them. She had been trained for this moment her entire life, trained to be silent, trained to be still, trained to accept whatever was given to her or taken from her without fighting back. To all these people watching her, she wasn't a real person with feelings and dreams. She was just a symbol, a business transaction, a reward to be handed out to someone who had earned it. A soft murmur began to spread through the crowd of nobles like ripples in a pond. Some sounded amused, some curious, some even a little sorry. For her, a prize, she thought bitterly to herself. "That's all I am to them, just a prize." A tall woman wearing a dress that sparkled like stars leaned over to whisper to the person standing next to her. "I had heard rumors that he would give her away eventually, but to a human?" She let out a small, delicate laugh. "What an insult." Another voice, this one older and rougher, answered back. "Not an insult, a test. Let's see how long it takes before he wishes he had never accepted such a useless thing." Lorana's stomach twisted into knots as she heard their words. She had no voice to defend herself with, no way to make them stop their cruel talk. She felt her father's gaze settle on her now, and she could sense his impatience growing thin like ice about to crack. He had never looked at her the way a father should look at his child, not with love, not even with simple duty, only with disappointment and anger. To him, she was nothing but a failure. She was his firstborn child, but she could never lead his armies or command his respect or carry on his family's legacy. In his eyes, she was a waste of good bloodline, a mistake that he had been stuck with for too long. She didn't know what hurt more, the hatred she could feel in his silence, or the fact that she had grown so used to it over the years that it barely surprised her anymore. She wanted to look away from his cold stare, to hide her face and pretend none of this was happening. But she knew better than that. Looking away would be seen as weakness, and she was tired of being weak. So instead, she forced herself to lift her chin up high, letting her long white hair fall over her shoulders like a waterfall as she met his gaze directly. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was the only one she could manage. The Baron's cruel smile grew wider as he saw her defiance. He turned back to face the human man. "She does not speak," he said with obvious satisfaction. "She cannot, but that should not matter to you. She will obey whatever you tell her to do." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd of nobles, and Lorana felt her chest grow tight with emotion. "They think I feel nothing," she realized. "They think that my silence means I don't understand how cruel they're being. They're wrong about that." And then, for the first time since this whole terrible ceremony had begun, she really looked at the man who was supposed to be her new owner. Commander Garen Wolf stood there in front of her father, but he wasn't laughing like the others. He wasn't sneering or smiling or even reacting to her father's insults. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that came from years of fighting battles. His body showed the wear and tear of someone who had survived many wars. A long scar ran from his temple down to the curve of his jaw, cutting through his tan skin like a permanent reminder of every fight he had lived through. His dark eyes were studying her carefully, but not with pity like she had expected, not with amusement like the nobles. There was something else in his gaze, something she couldn't quite put a name to. He had the straight-backed posture of a soldier, but there was something controlled about the way he stood. It was as if he was holding himself back, resisting the urge to move or speak or react to what was happening. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. The Baron chuckled with satisfaction. "No objections? No questions?" He waved his hand lazily in her direction. "She is yours now, a reward for all your loyalty to me. Take her and get out of my sight." Lorana's breath caught in her throat. And just like that, she thought, "I am given away like a piece of property." She saw Garen's jaw tighten slightly, but still he said nothing. Then, without any warning, he stepped forward toward her. She braced herself for what she expected to happen next. She thought he would grab her wrist roughly, claim her like the transaction she was meant to be. That was what any of the other men would have done. That was what her father wanted to see, a display of dominance, proof that she was now under someone else's control. But Garen did none of those things. Instead, he simply held out his hand toward her, not grabbing, not demanding, not commanding, just offering. It was a choice, not an order. The nobles began to murmur in confusion. "Why is he treating her like she's a real person?" They whispered to each other. Lorana's heart began to pound against her ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. No one had ever let her choose anything before in her entire life. Every decision had always been made for her. Her father's voice carried a warning tone. "She won't refuse you. She knows better than that." But that wasn't exactly true anymore, was it? She had never had a choice before, but now, suddenly she did. She looked down at Garen's outstretched hand, then back up at his face. His expression was still unreadable, like a mask carved from stone, but his eyes, those dark, steady eyes, held something she had never seen before. Understanding, maybe. Recognition. Does he actually see me? She wondered. Does he see me as a person, not just a prize? Her fingers trembled at her sides as she considered her options. She could stay here in this cold, silent life, where she would always be nothing and no one, or she could take his hand and walk into whatever unknown future awaited her. Lorana took a slow, deep breath. Then, before she could second-guess herself or lose her nerve, she reached forward and placed her small hand in his larger one. A complete hush fell over the entire chamber, as if everyone had stopped breathing at the same time. Garen's fingers closed around hers, but not in a forceful or possessive way. His grip was steady and sure, like an anchor in a storm. For the first time in her entire life, someone was not pulling her forward against her will or pushing her aside like she didn't matter. For the first time ever, she was moving because she had chosen to. The Baron said nothing more. He had already gotten what he wanted. She was no longer his problem to deal with. Garen turned toward the exit, gently leading her with him. The nobles continued to whisper and gossip behind them, but Lorana found that she didn't care what they were saying anymore. "I am leaving," she realized with amazement. It wasn't freedom, not yet. She didn't know what her life would be like now. But for the first time in her entire existence, it felt like the beginning of something new and different. As she walked through the towering doors of the Great Hall, leaving behind the only home she had ever known, her silent voice whispered, a truth she had never dared to believe before. Perhaps someone has finally heard me. The journey from her father's grand estate to the waiting spaceship was quiet, broken only by the steady rhythm of their boots against the polished stone pathway. Lorana walked beside Garen Wolf, her long white hair flowing behind her like liquid silver in the gentle breeze. Her green skin caught the faint glow of the floating lanterns that lit their way through the darkness. She kept her back straight and her face calm, just as she had been taught to do since childhood. But inside her mind, her thoughts were spinning like a whirlwind. They're still watching, she realized. Even now, as they walked away from the hall, she could feel eyes on them. The nobles had whispered as they left, some with scorn, some with amusement, some with curiosity. But not a single one of them had expected her to go willingly with this stranger. Did I go willingly? She asked herself. Her fingers twitched nervously at her sides as she thought about it. She hadn't fought back or tried to run away. But was that because she had truly chosen to leave? Or was it just because she was too tired to resist anymore? She glanced sideways at the human man walking beside her. He moved with the confident ease of someone who had spent many years in command of others. His steps were purposeful and sure, his expression as unreadable as it had been back in the hall. He had taken her hand. But what did that really mean? Where was he taking her now? What kind of life was waiting for her in whatever place they were going? As they approached the sleek spacecraft that would carry them away from this world, Lorana realized that for the first time in her life, she was about to find out what it meant to have a future that she couldn't predict. The thought terrified her, but it also, in some small way, made her feel more alive than she had in years. Hand back in the chamber, not in force, but in offering. And now he simply walked as if sensing she would follow, but never demanding it. Strange. Lana was used to people pushing, dragging or shoving her where they wanted. She was used to being overspoken for or ignorantarily. But Garen Wolf had not tested her silence. He had not tried to fill it with meaningless words. That more than anything unsettled her. The landing platform stretched ahead, a vast expanse of steel against the endless sky above it. Them nebulae swirled in deep blues and purples, stars blinking like distant watchful eyes. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of energy fields stabilizing the ship's docking bay. The vessel itself was sleek and dark, a human-made warship. Small, efficient, built for speed rather than comfort. Lorana recognized the design. No ornamentation, no wasted space. This is not a place for nobility. Garen approached the entrance and pressed a command into the panel. With a low hiss, the ship's ramp descended. He turned to her then as if expecting hesitation. She did not hesitate. She climbed the ramp, her steps measured, her pulse steady. If this was to be her future, she would meet it without tweeness. Inside, the ship was exactly as she expected, functional, sterile, efficient. The walls were deep gunmetal gray, the lighting dim but practical. It smelled of steel, engine oil, and something sharper, disinfectant. Perhaps the hum of machinery vibrated beneath her feet, the pulse of a living, moving thing. Garen led her through the corridors without a word. He did not glance back to see if she followed. He simply moved. She was grateful for Thessalon's. Finally, he stopped at a small door and keyed in a command. It slid open with a soft mechanical whir, revealing a compact room. A single Kotlin lined one wall, a storage compartment beside it, a small desk, a single chair. No decoration, no embellishments. This is yours, Garen said. His voice was calm-mannered. Lorana stepped inside, her golden eyes scanning every detail. The space was small, but hers. Garen lingered in the doorway. You can lock the door from the inside, he said, nodding toward the control panel. No one will enter without your permission. She turned to him sharply, studying his face. A lock? No one had ever given her a lock before. Ish had spent her life in places she could not escape, in rooms where others dictated when she entered and when she left. Why offer her this? Why give her a choice? What does he want? Garen held her gaze, reading her silence with the same patience he had shown since the moment they met. Then he simply said, "You don't trust me." Not a question of fact, Lorana did not answer. He nodded as if her silence was enough. Get some rest. He said, we leave orbit in an hour. And then he turned and walked away. The door slid shut behind him, sealing her in. Lynn exhaled, slow and deliberate. Her fingers hovered over the control panel. She pressed the lock. A soft beep, a small red light flickered to life. Lock. Sekirash took a step back and looked around the tiny space again. What now? Her inner life had been dictated by others, her father's expectations, the noble's scorn of future she had never been allowed to shape. Now she was on a human warship fading into the unknown with a man who had neither hurt her nor treated her like something fragile. That doesn't mean I'm free. Her hand curled into a fist. I didn't escape one cage just to be locked in another. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. She would not be a prisoner in it again. Lorana had never spoken a word, not because she didn't want to, not because she was afraid, but because she had been born this way. Silence had been her first companion, her only constant, woven into the very fabric of her existence. It wasn't a curse, nor was it a weakness, it simply was, and yet for as long as she could remember, others had treated it as a defect, a flaw that tainted her noble bloodline. They spoke around her, over her to her. They assumed silence meant ignorance, that her inability to speak meant an inability to understand wounds. She understood far more than they thought even. Now, sitting alone in the dim quarters of Garen Wool's ship, she could still hear the echoes of Thunable's laughter, the whispers of contempt, as her father handed her over like a discarded possession. But what lingered most was not the scorn in their voice, it was the way Garen had not laughed. She had expected mockery, expected indifference, expected to be treated as little more than an object, but instead he had given her something no one ever had, a choice. That was what unsettled her most. Lorena sat stiffly on the cot, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The ship hummed around her, the steady vibration beneath her feet a reminder that she was far from the cold marble halls of her father's estate. Here there were no silken drapes, no hovering chandeliers, no suffocating perfume of aristocracy, only metal and machinery, function over form. It was foreign, but not unpleasant. A soft chime from the door pulled her from her thoughts. She tensed, fingers twitching slightly. It was not an intrusion. The door was locked, and whoever stood on the other side had requested entry rather than forced it. A simple gesture, yet another reminder that Garen Wolf operated by rules she did not yet understand. Lorena pressed the panel, releasing the lock. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing Garen standing in the threshold. He was dressed as before, dark, practical clothing, now necessary ornamentation, a soldier's attire. But it was his expression that caught her attention. Calm, observant, he held something in his hands, a tray carrying a sealed meal pack and a steaming cup. You didn't eat, he said, his tone matter of fact. Lana simply looked at him. She had no way to deny or confirm his words, but he was right. She hadn't touched the rations provided in her room. It wasn't out of defiance. She simply hadn't thought to. Aaron took a step inside, set the tray on the desk, then stepped back. No expectations, no demands. He didn't even motion for her to take it. He only spoke once more. You should. And then he left. The door slid shut, leaving her alone once more. Lana stared at the tray. She had expected something else. What? She wasn't sure. Admin, perhaps some attempt to assert control. A reminder that she was a reward, not a guest. That was how it had always been. That was how her father would have treated someone in her position, but Garen had simply left the food and walked away. Strange, the ship remained in transit, the low hum of its systems filling the silence as time stretched on. She did not attempt to explore, nor did she leave the confines of her quarters. She was not yet sure if she could, not because she was locked in, but because she did not know what to do with this unfamiliar freedom. When the next chime came, she was almost expecting it again, a request again. She pressed the panel. This time Garen entered carrying 2 steaming cups. The scent was bitter, sharp, curling through the air like something freshly ground. He placed one on the desk, then without a word sat in only chair. He did not offer explanations, did not ask permission, but there was something about the way he moved, slow and deliberate, that made it clear he was not imposing. Lorana remained standing. Garen took a slow sip from his cup, then exhaled through his nose in something that was not quite a sigh. You're not a prisoner. Lana's gaze harpened. His voice was level, steady. I don't know what your father told you. I didn't know what he expects from this, or what you expect, but I'm not him. He motioned toward The cup he had placed for her. Drink if you want or don't. Lena hesitated. It was a test. It had to be. Everything in her life had been a test, but he wasn't watching her like a predator waiting for a reaction. He simply sipped his drink, his posture as relaxed as if they had known each other for years rather than mere hours. The Rana stepped forward and wrapped her hands around the cup. It was warm, the ceramic smooth beneath her fingers. If this is a game, I do not know the rules. She lifted the cup to her lips and took a careful sip. The bitterness curled around her tongue, but the heat was grounding, steadying. Garen set his own cup down. I didn't think I've ever met someone who says so much without speaking. A flicker of something passed through her chest, too quick to name. He leaned forward slightly. I need to know how to communicate with you. She frowned slightly. I don't expect you to speak, he clarified, but I need to understand you. Lana's fingers tightened around the cube. Understand me? No one has ever tried. Garen seemed to read her hesitation. He lifted his hand and deliberately pointed at the cup. This is drink. Lorana blinked, then before she could stop herself, her lips twitched, something dangerously close to amusement flickering across her face. Garen raised an eyebrow. Not helpful. She reached forward and tapped the cupins. He tilted his head. All right. He tapped the cup as well. She hesitated, then nodded slightly. He gave a small nod in return. Good, that's a start. He then gestured toward her. You? Lorena narrowed her eyes slightly. He repeated the motion. You. Slowly she lifted a hand and touched her fingertips to her chest. Garen nodded. See, we're already making progress. He tapped his own chest. Garen. She stared at him, then after a long moment she mimicked the motion. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement, not triumph, something quieter. Now we're talking. A strange warmth settled in her chest, unwelcome and unfamiliar. This man, this human, was doing something no one had ever done before. He was trying to understand her. Lana wasn't sure if that made him dangerous or something else entirely. The ship drifted through the void, its engines a steady hum beneath the metal floors. Outside, space stretched endless and silent, stars scattered like distant embers too far away to offer warmth. Inside, the quiet was heavier, pressing in on Lana from all sides. Not the suffocating silence of her father's court, nor the cold dismissal of nobles who had laughed as she was given away. This was a different kind of quiet, one filled with expectation. Garen Wolf was watching her. He wasn't staring exactly, but his gaze was steady, thoughtful, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't yet understand. She had seen that look before, but never directed at her. No one had ever bothered to try understanding her. She sat across from him in the ship's masal, a small, practical space designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The overhead lights cast a muted glow, making the cold metal seem softer than it was. A tray of untouched food rested between them, a mirror of the one he had left for her earlier. She hadn't eaten then. She wasn't sure if she would eat now. Garen took a slow sip from a metal cup, the warmth off drink curling into the air between them. He didn't speak right away, didn't try to force conversation, and yet somehow the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Finally he exhaled, setting the cup down with a quiet clink. You know, he said, voice low and steady, I've worked with plenty of people who didn't say much. Some because they prefer it that way, others because they don't have a choice. His eyes flickered to her, assuring her reaction. But you say everything without speaking at all. Vera studied him, unreadable. She wasn't sure how to respond to that, if she should respond. She had no words to offer, only the language of movement, of stillness, off small shifts in her posture that most overlooked. Garen leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. I've been trying to figure out how to communicate with you, he admitted. You understand me? Fine, but I don't want to rely on that alone. She raised a brow, tilting her head slightly. He smirked. Adaya, I caught that. You do that when you're curious. Lana stilled. No one had ever pointed out the things she did, the small gestures, the shifts in her expression. She hadn't realized they were even noticeable. Garen took another sip of his drink, watching her over the rim of his cup. I need to know what works for you, how you can tell me what you need, what you want. She didn't react outwardly, but something in her chest tightened. She had never been allowed to want before. Lorena lowered her gaze to the tray in front of her, untouched food carefully arranged in small compartments. Is that what this is, Adis? She reached out slowly, fingers grazing the edge of the tray, then hesitated. Garen didn't press her, didn't tell her to eat, didn't push the tray closer. He just waited. That, more than anything, made her decision for her. She picked up one of the nutrient bars, examining it carefully. Before taking a small measured bite, the taste was bland but not unpleasant, functional, efficient, like everything else on this ship. Garen nodded, slightly satisfied but not triumphant. See, that wasn't so hard. Shen narrowed her eyes at him, but he only smirked. I need to know if something's wrong, he continued, serious now. If you're hurt, if you need something. He tapped the table lightly. You need a way to tell. Milana considered that she hadn't thought about it before, hadn't needed to. No one had ever cared what she needed. She tapped a single finger against the metal tray. Garen's eyes flickered with something like amusement. All right, one tap means yes. She inclined her head slightly. He drummed his fingers against the table, thinking. 2 taps for no. A pause, then she tapped twice. His smirk returned. See, we're already making progress. Lana pressed her lips together, suppressing a reaction. She didn't fully understand. This was new, strange, the idea that someone was trying to work with her rather than around her. She lifted her hand, then hesitated before tapping her fingertips lightly against the table. Garen's expression shifted, his eyes sharpening. He mirrored the motion. A single curious tap. That one's new, he murmured. She tapped it again. Garen frowned slightly, considering a question. Lana nodded once. His gaze flickered with something unreadable before he nodded back. All right, I can work with that. Something in her chest uncoiled. Not relief, not exactly, but something close. The moment passed, and Garen stood stretching slightly. We'll be reaching the outer colonies soon, he said. I need to check the nav systems. He glanced at her once more. You're free to explore the ship if you want. You don't have to stay locked in here. Lana's fingers twitched free. She had never been locked, and not physically, but stepping beyond the confines of these walls felt like something else entirely. Garen watched her a moment longer, then gave a small nod before heading toward the door. He paused just before stepping through, glancing back at her. You know, he said, for someone who doesn't speak, you're a lot louder than you think. And then he was gone. Laura Nairmond, where she was staring at the empty space where he had stood. She wasn't sure if she should be offended by that statement or strangely pleased. Her fingers drummed once against the table, testing the feeling. The small rhythmic sound filled the silence around her. No oppressive, not forced, just her. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as silent as Thale believed. Lorana had never let anyone touch her before, not willingly, not without tensing, without waiting for some unspoken demand to follow. But now Escarin carefully wrapped a bandage around her hand. She found herself still watching him work. The cut wasn't deep, just a small slice across her palm from a loose piece of metal. In the ship's engine room, a foolish mistake, one she wouldn't have made if she had been paying more attention, but she had been watching him, studying the way he moved, how his hands were steady, precise, as he repaired a damaged circuit. She had been distracted. And now Garen Wolf was crouched in front of her, his fingers warm as they pressed the bandage into place. You need to be more careful, he muttered, securing the wrap. Ship engine Esserant, as forgiving as people. Lorena raised her brow. Who said people were forgiving? Garen smirked like he had heard the thought. All right, bad example. She exhaled through her nose, mouthing dangerously close to amusement flickering across her face. And then the ship lurched violently. A metallic groan echoed through the walls as the floor tilted beneath them. Lana's balance shifted, but before she could react, Garen caught her wrist, steadying her. The moment stretched. His grip was firm but not forceful, a reflex, a silent promise. I won't let you fall. Lorna swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the warmth of his fingers against her skin. She should pull away. She had always pulled away, but she didn't. She let him hold her just a second longer than necessary, and then the ship jolted again, harder this time, and an alarm blared through the speakers. Garen's expression hardened. He released her and was already moving. Stay here, he ordered, voice clipped as he grabbed his communicator. Tell me if Lorana was already following him. Garen shot her a look but didn't argue. They ran through the narrow corridors, boots pounding against metal. The ship shuddered around them, the hum of the engines strained. They reached the cockpit just as the proximity alarms screamed. Shit, Garen muttered under his breath. Nirhana didn't need to ask why. Through the wide viewport she saw them, three sleek ships, fast and heavily armed, cutting through the darkness of space like predators locking onto their prey. Pirates, their ships bore no insignia, no official markings. Raiders, opportunists. The Kindwa didn't care who you were, only what you carried, and right now they were hunting Garen's ship. Garen dropped in toth pilot seat, fingers flying across the controls. They must think we're carrying something valuable. Lana's fingers curled into fists. They think wrong. The cum crackled to life, and a voice, low, roughless with arrogance, filled the cockpit. Unidentified vessel, power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Garen let out a sharp breath, flicking a switch that cut the audio transmission off mid-thread. That's not happening. Lorana slid into the co-pilot seat, scanning the control panels. She had never flown, but she knew enough from watching her father's military Briefings to recognize upon systems and defensive measures. Garen's eyes flicked to her sharp with assist. Trust you want to help keep an eye on their movement. Tell me if they try to flank us. Lorana tapped the screen in front of her, analyzing the enemy's formation. They weren't attacking yet, testing, waiting, like a pack of wolves circling a wounded animal. She pointed at the leftmost ship, tapping the screen twice. Garen nodded. Yeah, I see it. The tones trying to break off for a blindside approach. His hands moved over the controls, the ship jerking hard to the right just as a blast of plasma fire grazed their hull. Too close to them, close. Lorana's breath came faster, her heart pounding against her ribs. The ship shook again as another blast rocked them from below. Sparks flew from one of the overhead panels, the scent of burning circuits filling the air, and then a sharp and sudden. Lorana gasped as something struck her side, a loose metal console thrown free by the impact. It slammed into her ribs, knocking her breath away. She crumpled forward, her vision blurring. Lorena Garen was there before she could even process what had happened, one arm around her back, pulling her upright, his hands burned against her skin, pressing against the impact wound, checking for worse damage. Her head spun too much to fast. Stay with me. Garen's voice was lower, now edged with some methingal moss-like fear. I need you to focus. Lana's fingers clutched at his sleeve, breath shallow, the pressure in her chest tightened, not just from the pain but from something else, something raw, unreal, and terrifying. She had never let anyone hold her before, never let anyone be close, and yet here she was gripping his sleeve like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. His hand pressed against the side of her face just for a second, brushing back a strand of silver white hair that had fallen into her eyes. We're going to get through this, you hear me? She nodded, but something in her chest something she didn't understand, and then her eyes snapped to the viewport. A shape moved in Theshadow's, one of the pirate ships, repositioning. Garen hadn't seen it. He was to focused on her. Lorena tried to warn him, tried to shout, his mouth open, but nothing came out. His heart was pounding. He tried again, his throat was on fire. The attacker went on the offensive, and then Garen, the name ripped from his throat, raw and sharp, echoing in the narrow space. Garen turned instant, lippering the knife just in time. His expression barely had time to change from surprise. He drew his gun, and Fared, the shot found its mark. The attacker collapsed, motionless. Silence, a heavy-weighted silence. Lana froze, her own breath echoing loudly in her ears. Her chest rose and fell, her throat ached with the effort to say a single word, an impossible word. Garen turned to her slowly, his eyes wide with shock. Lorana, he took a step forward, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. You spoke. She swallowed, tried to do it again, but no sound came out. His throat was irritated, his whole body trembling from the effort, but it didn't matter. He had done it. He had spoken. Garen's expression softened when spoke. His voice was calm, steady. I heard you, and for the first time in his life he believed it. The ship drifted through deep space, the wreckage of the pirate vessels floating lifeless lie behind them. The battle was over, the immediate danger had passed, but Grink knew better than to relax just yet. Lorena was still standing near the viewport, her fingers absently brushing against her throat. She had spoken a single word, but it had changed everything. He could see it in the way she held herself now, still cautious, still guarded, but no longer trapped. A soft beep echoed through the cockpit. Incoming transmission. Garen's jaw tightened. He flicked a switch, bringing up the com screen. An incoming vessel, no parade markings, no criminal signatures. This wasn't another threat, this was Thela, a cold voice filtered through the speakers. Unregistered vessel, this is Marshal Devon of the Outer Rim Authority. Your ship's distress signal was detected. You are within our jurisdiction. State your status. Garen muttered a curse under his breath. Of course. Lorena turned slightly, watching him. Garen hit the com switch. Marshal, this is Captain Garen Wolf. Situation is contained. Pirates attempted to board my ship unsuccessfully. A pause, then the Marshal's voice again, sharper this time. Wolf, you again? Lana's eyes flickered with curiosity. The Marshal continued, tone unreadable. We're reading multiple life signs aboard your ship. Stand by for inspection. Garen sighed heavily and ran a hand down his face. Looks like we're getting company, he muttered, shooting Lorana a sideways glance. Try to look innocent. She raised an eyebrow. A few minutes later, a sleek black and gold patrol vessel pulled up alongside them. The docking clamps engaged, and with a sharp metallic hiss the airlocks connected. The doors slid open. Ushul Devon stepped onto the ship, flanked by two officers in dark, reinforced uniform. She was tall, lean, and had the air of a man who had seen too much, but still hadn't lost his edge. A blaster rested at his hip, but his hands remained loose, relaxed. He wasn't looking for a fight. His sharp, silver gray eyes landed on Garen first. You really don't know how to stay out of trouble, do you? Garen crossed his arms. Trouble seems to find me. Devon's gaze flicked to Lana, studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. And this one, Lorana tense, said she. felt Garen shift beside her, a subtle movement, but one that placed him between her and the marshal. "She's with me," Garen said flatly. Devon's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't push. Instead, he glanced at the sealed cargo bay doors. "I assume that's where your operates are. They're alive. Most of them anyway," Garen replied. Devon exhaled sharply. "Guess I should be grateful for that." He nodded to his men. Secure the prisoners. The officers moved past them, weapons drawn, but unnecessary. Theparates had been defeated before they even knew what was happening. As Devon turned back to Garen, his gaze lingered once more on Lorana. She held herself still, unreadable, just as she always had. "You got a name?" the marshal asked her. Lana hesitated, then slowly she lifted her hand to her throat. She parted her lips, tried to force the sound, but still nothing came. The marshal frowned slightly. His gaze flickered to Garen, as if expecting an explanation. "She doesn't talk," Garen said simply. Devon studied her a moment longer before finally nodding. "Fine." His tone was unreadable, but something about the way he looked at her said he wasn't convinced. Still, he didn't press. "He point well. Take the pirates off your hands," Dan said, turning back to Garen. "But next time try not to leave so much wreckage. Make space travel messy." "I'll do my best," Garen said dryly. The marshal gave a final glance between them before stepping back toward the airlock. "Take care of yourself, Wolf, and watch your back." Then he was gone. The moment the airlock sealed behind them, Garen exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Well," he muttered, "that was fun." Lana remained silent, her mind still racing from the encounter, the marshal, the questions, the fact that for a brief second she had tried to speak again. She could still feel it lingering at the edge of her mind, a voice waiting to be freed. Garen turned toward her. His voice was quieter now. "You okay?" She met his gaze, then slowly, deliberately she lifted her hand, pressed her fingers to her throat, then tapped once against the metal wall beside her. Yet Garen smirked. "Good." She turned away, stepping toward the viewport, staring out into the endless dark. The pirates were gone. Thela had noticed them, and her voice was waiting. For the first time in her life, Esh wasn't afraid to find it, because now she knew she could. Days passed. The ship drifted through space, the hum of the engines steady, a constant rhythm beneath their feet. The battle with the pirates was behind them. The Outer Rim marshal had taken their prisoners, leaving Garen and Lana alone, once more surrounded by the vast and endless void. But something had changed. Lyanna felt it in the way Garen looked at her, not with pity, not with expectation, but with something deeper, something that made her chest feel tight whenever their eyes met. And she felt it within herself. She had spoken a single word, and though it had been ripped from her in desperation, forced out by sheer instinct, it had been real, it had been hers. She had spent her life believing she would never have a voice, that she would never be heard. But now she knew the truth. She could speak, she just had to fight for it. And so she tried. When she was alone in her quarter, she pressed her fingers to her throat, willing the sound to come. Some nights she barely managed a breath. Other nights she felt the vibration, the hint of a word, trapped just beyond reach. But she kept trying. And Garen, he never asked, never pushed, but he knew. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. A flicker of something in his eyes. Not hope, no expectation, but patience. He was waiting, or her, for the moment. She was ready. And tonight, she would be the moment. Lana found him on the bridge, seated in pilot's chair, boots propped lazily against the control panel as he stared out at the endless dark. His posture was relaxed, but she knew better. Garen Wolf was never truly at ease. The weight of survival of his pastaways rested on his shoulders. She had never asked about it, just as he had never asked about hers, but she felt it, the way shadows lingered behind his eyes, the way he carried himself like a man who had spent too long in the depths of war. And yet with her he was different. Stepped closer, he heard her approach, but didn't turn. "Couldn't sleep," Lorna hesitated. Then slowly she shook her head. Garen exhaled through his nose, a small gnawing sound. "Yeah, me neither." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then she moved. It was small, just a step closer, but he noticed. She stood beside him, her presence a quiet weight in the dim light of the bridge. He finally looked at her, then his gaze steady, waiting. Lana's pulse was hammering. She had fought battles with her own body, her own mind, but this would be the hardest fight of all. She swallowed, her hand lifted, pressing gently to her throat. Garen sat up slowly, his boots dropping to the floor, his full attention now on her. She could see it. The moment realization settled into his features. He knew what she was about to do. Lana took a slow breath. "Just One word she had spoken before she could do it again. Her lips parted, her voice raw broken, the sound scraping out of her like something heavy being pulled from deep within. Garen didn't move, didn't breathe. Lorana's throat burned her entire body, trembling from the effort. But she wasn't stopping. Not this time. She clenched her fists, forced air through her lungs, pushed. The word cracked, barely more than a whisper, but it was real. Garen's eyes widened, his breath hitched. Lorana gasped for air, her body shaking, her heart pounding so fast she could barely hear past it. One more word. She forced herself forward, breaking through the silence that had ruled her for a lifetime. Yep, the moment stretched into eternity. Then Garen moved fast, certain his hands framed her face, rough and warm and real, pulling her toward him, and then kissed her. It wasn't hesitant, it wasn't soft, it was fierce, desperate, like had been waiting for this moment as long as she had been waiting for her voice. Lorana melted into him, into the warmth of his touch and the solid weight of his presence. She had never been touched this way, not in control, not with meaning. Her hands gripped his jacket, pulling him closer, grounding herself in this moment, in this feeling. When they finally pulled apart, Garen rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven, his hands still holding her like he was afraid to let go. His voice was when he finally spoke. Say it again. Lorana's chest tightened. She opened her mouth, tried nothing. Her throat burned. The words trapped on Seymour. Not yet. But Garen only smiled. He lifted a hand, brushing his thumb gently over her lips. It's okay. His voice was low, steady. You don't have to. He leaned in, pressing a final lingering kiss against her forehead. I heard you. Lorena closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. She had said it, and he knew that was enough. But one day she would say again, and this time she wouldn't stop.